Hi, my name is Danny and I am alcoholic. I was recently asked to share over 4 sessions my experience and my knowledge of recovery with a simple solution found in the book Alcoholics Anonymous, offering strength and hope. As I'd done the work putting this together, I thought I'd record it and share with folk in the thought it might be of some help. So this is the first of 4 1-hour videos. This first share begins with the problem, Step 1. Over the next 3 videos I will discuss the solution, the power, how to access the power, and how to live by that power. Now, I first came to the rooms in the autumn of 2002. My sobriety date is October the 10th, 2003, and I would say that I became aware that I had recovered in the spring, probably 2005, and I've not turned back since. I'm going to break these shares into 4 sections. Today I'm going to talk about the problem, what it means to be alcoholic from my perspective, and of course what is taught in the book Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, I'm not going to attempt to answer why I'm alcoholic. I don't know why. I thought I did. I certainly grew up in a terrifying messed up world, I suppose, or it seemed that way to me. I lived in a state of fear throughout my childhood. That said, my brothers and my sisters grew up in the same world. They suffered from the same childhood traumas, and they did not become alcoholic. They have struggled with life, but not from alcoholism or addiction. By the way, Alcoholics Anonymous does not answer the question why. It just describes symptoms and a solution. And it states there is a solution. We cannot answer the riddle. So I ain't going to try. How many of us waste years searching for the answer to why? As if that would give us any power anyway, instead of just accepting that there is a solution. Isn't that what we want? Certainly what I want, and certainly what I needed. So what is it that makes one an alcoholic? Well, I'm going to begin at chapter 3, more about alcoholism, page 30. Most of us have been unwilling to admit we were real alcoholics. No person likes to think he is bodily and mentally different from his fellows. Therefore, it's not surprising that our drinking careers have been characterised by countless vain attempts to prove that we could drink like other people. The idea that somehow, someday, he will control and enjoy his drinking is the great obsession of every abnormal drinker. The persistence of this illusion is astonishing. Many pursue it into the gates of insanity or death. An alcoholic is bodily and mentally different from someone who is not, in certain specific ways. There's something different bodily and mentally in specific ways. Now, I often hear senseless arguments in the fellowship in the rooms over whether alcoholism is a 2-fold or a 3-fold illness. I'm sure you've heard them too. You may have some very strong opinions. Some of us have some very strong opinions either way. What I would like to say about this right from the very beginning is that I think we're all wrong, actually, and yet at the same time we're all kind of right when we argue, when we talk about it being 2 or 3-fold. You see, the problem is in the language that's used. The phrase 2-fold or 3-fold disease is not found anywhere in the book Alcoholics Anonymous. It's not the language of Alcoholics Anonymous. Alcoholics Anonymous describes how we are different bodily and mentally from non-alcoholic people. And it also speaks of a spiritual malady. But it does not suggest that this spiritual malady is a unique characteristic of an alcoholic, but something that most people suffer from to a greater or a lesser degree. The problem for the alcoholic is that the malady must be overcome in order to recover from alcoholism. So my plea really is to stop with the divisive language. When sharing, please do describe how we are bodily and mentally different. But do not deny the spiritual malady, which of course every human suffers from to some degree or another, and it must be overcome in order for an alcoholic to recover from alcoholism. Now, I'm not going to be talking about the spiritual malady in this session. I'll go into more detail about that in the next one as I discuss the solution, the power. Today I will discuss what makes us bodily and mentally different, what it means to have lost both the power of control and, of course, the power of choice. Although I will just offer here what the book states on page 64 about the malady. For we have been not only mentally and physically ill, we have been spiritually sick. When the spiritual malady is overcome, we straighten out mentally and physically. The solution treats the malady. But like I say, I'll look at that properly next time. So I'm going to talk about the great obsession. I'm going to discuss what we mean by the great obsession. You often hear the word obsession in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous, or the great obsession. So the great obsession, which, as chapter 4 more about alcoholism, page 30 states, is the idea that somehow, someday, he will control and enjoy his drinking, is the great obsession of every abnormal drinker. When Alcoholics Anonymous speaks of obsession, it is referring to this idea specifically, that one day we will be able to drink like a non-alcoholic person. It is not the suggestion that the thought is constant, but that somehow deep inside is this nagging delusion, and this nagging delusion must be smashed. Looking back at my drinking and using, really, the idea of giving up everything completely was never in my thinking. The idea of living in the world sober was utterly terrifying. Sobriety seemed was utterly miserable, actually. That saying though, being off my head at the end became suicidally terrifying. It was far worse at the end, but in my early days, sobriety was my issue. Being in the world without alcohol was my problem. I couldn't face life. But in the end, I couldn't live with it or live without it. Once I had my very first taste, it had me from the very start. Yes, I gave up hard drugs for periods of time, but I always drank. There were also periods when I tried to control the amount I drank. I succeeded actually on I can think of two specific occasions towards the end, really, maybe in the last year. And they were the two most miserable experiences of my whole life with alcohol. I drank 6 pints of Stella Artois over 4 hours, one every 45 minutes, and then I would go to the bar religiously. I decided to do what the person from the community alcohol team was I decided this with them. I'd agreed that that's what I would do. I enjoyed the evening with my friends. I really enjoyed the pats on the back for being a gentleman. But that night I went home and I lay on my bed with my eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. They were the two most miserable nights of my life. I tried again, but I was never able to stay in control again. Things just quickly got worse actually after that. There were other disciplines around work which I put in place, which succeeded for short periods of time. I rebuilt my life over and over again. I saw all kinds of professionals who tried to teach me control. I remember going to anger management, and that just wound me up even more. These ridiculous hippie women in their flowing skirts, playing whale music and talking calmly to me in some building in Chorlton. Just wound me. I'm sure it'd be lovely now, but in those days it just really got me angry. Got me more angry. I tried acupuncture and psychotherapy. I moved away, got my dream job. I fell in love a couple of times. All of this worked for short periods of time in bringing some stability to my life. But the idea of quitting drinking for good, quitting completely, that never entered my mind until I woke up that day after a particularly terrifying psychotic episode. It had taken 4 friends to bring me to the ground by beating me on the legs and making me collapse as I was running around the room in the house, screaming about devils and demons, running headfirst into the walls, headbutting the walls, screaming out loud. And then I apparently just went sparko, and they put me to bed. I came out of this terrifying blackout, and a voice inside me compelled me compel me to mouth out loud these words: I have got to stop drinking. There was no one there to hear me, but that morning I had had enough. And you know something? I've never wanted or needed a drink since that day. I never wanted a drink, and I've certainly never needed one. That said, I relapsed many, many times over the next 12 months, or I went back drinking. I wanted to stop so desperately. I never wanted to drink again. I accepted the obsession, even though, of course, I didn't have the language then. That said, that wasn't enough to keep me sober. I came to my first AA meeting only 2 days later on the recommendation of someone I've met online to do with something completely different, some childhood stuff. But he was 20 years sober in AA, and he'd been talking to me for quite some time and suggested that maybe it might help me. I wonder how he worked that one out. Now, I know for many the surrender to the obsession does not come before they come to their very first meeting, but it did for me. That is my experience. But I still relapsed many times. I didn't want to, I didn't need to, but I was powerless over the decision as to whether I drank or not, and I did not know that at the time. The recovery process begins with this first step: acceptance. This idea of fully conceding deep down within ourselves, without any doubt, that we are powerless over alcohol, and that we are beyond human aid, that we are bodily and mentally different, that we have lost the power of control and the power of choice, the two together. Page 30. We learned that we had to fully concede to our innermost selves that we were alcoholics. This is the first step in recovery. The delusion that we are like other people, or presently maybe, has to be smashed. Has to be smashed. I just shared earlier about my surrender to the physical aspect of the illness. I'd had enough that day. I wanted to quit for good and for all, as Dr. Bob would say. I knew I couldn't take anything again. I could not drink again. But you know, I knew that before I came to AA, or just before that morning when I woke up. I just lacked the language at the time. But I had had enough. But having enough is not enough for a man like me. It's not enough. Having enough is not in itself enough. Having had enough. Important that I recognise that and share that with you. It took me another year of relapsing in the rooms, coming to meetings day after day, and then being taken back by the insanity every few weeks and going on another binge. It took me all that year to fully concede to my innermost self that not only was I physically different, but I was mentally different too. I woke up a year later after another period of hell with this voice again inside me. It's not a real voice, obviously not words, but something telling me deep down inside, compelling me to say it out loud again, even though again there was no one there, that I could not do this. I could not stay away from one drink, one day at a time, that I was powerless, that I was beyond human aid, that I had conceded to both of these facts, to my innermost self, the core of my humanity, the core of my being. And that was October the 10th, 2003. I was ready then at this point to take certain steps. When I first came to AA, I'd had enough. It took me a year of going back drinking to be ready to take certain steps, to do something about it really. I'd just been sat in the waiting room and not treating my illness. And how often do I see people do that? Just sitting in the waiting room expecting it to treat their illness. We wouldn't do that with anything else, would we? We'd take the medication, take the treatment, but I wouldn't, because I didn't understand what was wrong with me. I didn't have a full knowledge of my condition. I'm going to look at what makes us alcoholics here, according to Alcoholics Anonymous, that is. What makes us how we are bodily and mentally different from non-alcoholic people. I'm going to discuss what it means now to have lost the power of control, and then I'll talk about what it means to have lost the power of choice. And I will share my experience, I will share my knowledge, but I will share my experience too. We need them both. One without the other doesn't seem to work, does it? Never worked for me. I'm going to talk about the physical now, what it means to have lost the power of control. Let's explore what Alcoholics Anonymous suggests makes us bodily different. Now, the doctor's opinion suggests that alcoholic people process alcohol abnormally compared to non-alcoholic people. Now, this was considered controversial at the time in the 1930s when this book came out. This identification of alcoholism as a distinct illness. For before that, really, it was considered more a moral weakness, a moral issue, really. Now, it's interesting to note that the first edition of the book Alcoholics Anonymous, the story of how many thousands of men and women have recovered from alcoholism, although it was 100 then, of course. That first edition, the good doctor did not put his name to it. It just said Anonymous. Dr. William D. Siltless' name was only added after he died for the second edition. Why? I don't know. I'm sure the people have got theories about that. I just think it's an interesting observation. I suspect it was in keeping with the anonymity of the rest of the book. But I also suspect it was probably because it was quite a controversial opinion, his opinion at the time. As I say, before that it was thought more to be a moral issue, a moral kind of corrupt weakness in people. So here's some bits from the doctor's opinion. Page XXVIII. The action of alcohol on these chronic alcoholics is a manifestation of analogy, that the phenomenon of craving is limited to this class and never occurs in the average temperate drinker. It never occurs in a non-alcoholic person. Yes, they can overindulge, but that's not because of the craving, the physical abnormality. It's a distinct entity, as he says. Page XXVIII. These allergic types can never safely use alcohol in any form at all, and once having formed the habit and found they cannot break it, once having lost their self-confidence, their reliance upon all things human, their problems pile up on them and become astonishingly difficult to solve. They can never use alcohol in any form at all. They can never use alcohol in any form at all. That's really in any form at all. And, you know, I extend that to other substances too. In any form at all. Be careful with food, with medication, even mouthwash. Watch out, really. I'm not talking about prescribed medication that's for medical conditions, so long as a person is completely honest with the professionals. I myself had surgery a couple of years ago. I had to have an anaesthetic and painkillers for a few days, but I was very clear when I spoke with and explained everything to the medical professionals. After a couple of days, I only took the painkillers at night just to allow me to sleep because the pain would come on in the night. And after 5 days, I was completely free. But I took what I needed to take under medical supervision. People do need to do that. I ain't a doctor, and I wouldn't even suggest anything in that area. But I don't mess with this stuff. I am bodily different. I respect that. I accept what I am. And if we've got the physical abnormality, we have it for life. It does not go away. If we are to stop, we have to do so for good and for all. We're like men who have lost their legs, they never grow new ones, to quote chapter 3. The physical aspect never changes. If we do not accept this reality, then we are feeding the great obsession that one day we will be able to control and enjoy our drinking at some date in the future, some promised land, somewhere over the rainbow, if you like. More about alcoholism, pages 30 to 31. We alcoholics are men and women who have lost the ability to control our drinking. We know that no real alcoholic ever recovers control. All of us felt at times that we were regaining control, but such intervals, usually brief, were inevitably followed by still less control, which led in time to pitiful and incomprehensible demoralisation. We are convinced to a man that alcoholics of our type are in the grip of a progressive illness. Over any considerable period we get worse, never better. We are like men who have lost their legs, they never grow new ones. Neither does there appear to be any kind of treatment which will make alcoholics of our kind like other men. In the chapter There is a Solution, it explains, pages 22 to 23. We know that while the alcoholic keeps away from drink, as he may do for months or years, he reacts much like other men. We are equally positive that once he takes any alcohol whatever into his system, something happens both in the bodily and mental sense which makes it virtually impossible for him to stop. The experience of any alcoholic will abundantly confirm this. Now, for some folks, this abnormality is there from the very beginning, whereas for others it kind of develops and progresses over time. Either way, it doesn't really matter. Once you have it, once you pass that point, you've got it permanently. You can't go back permanently to normal drinking. If you find that you can, then you weren't a real alcoholic anyway, not the alcoholic that is being described in Alcoholics Anonymous at least. You may have had a problem with alcohol. It's not the same. Now, for me personally, it would appear right from the very beginning that the physical abnormality was always there. The very first time I had freedom with alcohol was at my stepbrother, my oldest stepbrother's wedding, when I'd be about 11 years old. He married a woman whose family were deeply religious and would not provide alcohol for the wedding guests. Now, our Alan, being your classic tight Yorkshireman, paid for one drink for everyone, bought enough booze for everybody to have one drink on him. But it was manky, or so that's what the folks said, and no one wanted it, no one touched it. Well, no one except for me and our Paul. We went around every single table and just kept on drinking and drinking, nicking all those drinks basically. And we were both found later on. Our Paul found in a pile of puke. Apparently on the way home his granddad kept having to hold his head over a sink. And me, I was found behaving very differently, abnormally somewhere. You see, I was this normally I was this nice quiet little kid. But not that day. And you know what? I was hooked from that very day. Whenever I drank as a child and a teenager, I would drink to oblivion, and I would always puke until maybe I was about 16, and I got a stomach for it. Now, there were periods where environmental factors imposed some control over my drinking, but never complete control again, apart from those two incidents that I shared about earlier that stick in my mind, those two occasions. Now, of course, it moved into other substances later, and the result was always the same with them too. Once I started, I only stopped when consciousness ended, and it always got a lot crazier as time went by. Now, I mentioned other substances. The insane thing was that because I could stop, say, harder drugs like LSD and stuff like that, or I could discipline myself for periods of time through work and changing lifestyle, I still had this delusion that I could control it. When I wanted, I just drank the way I did because I like getting off my face, I suppose. But it was a delusion. I could not see the truth. I wasn't in denial. I was deluded. I could not see the truth. It's interesting, the book doesn't talk about denial, does it? It talks about illusion and delusion. The only place you'll see the word denial in the book Alcoholics Anonymous is when Bill's talking about his grandfather and his denial of the preacher's right to, his issues around religion. They use the word illusion and delusion. We're not seeing the truth. It's not that we're denying the truth. We can't see the truth, and I certainly could not see it. It was a deeper state, really, than denial. See, the problem was, as it is for most of us, that I was the real deal alcoholic, and I suffered from that great obsession. The real deal always suffers from the great obsession, and the great obsession is that one day they will be able to control and enjoy our drinking. This illness doesn't want me to believe that. And I don't think it wants any of us to believe that. So we try all kinds of ways to prove that we can drink like non-alcoholic people. Page 31 states, despite all we can say, many who are real alcoholics are not going to believe that they're in that class. By every form of self-deception and experimentation, they will try to prove themselves exceptions to the rule, therefore non-alcoholic. If anyone who is showing inability to control his drinking can do the right about face and drink like a gentleman, our hats are off to him. Heaven knows we have tried hard enough and long enough to drink like other people. Here are some of the methods that we have tried. Drinking beer only, limiting the number of drinks, never drinking alone, never drinking in the morning, drinking only at home, never having it in the house, never drinking during business hours, drinking only at parties, switching from scotch to brandy, drinking only natural wines, agreeing to resign if ever drunk on the job, taking a trip, not taking a trip, swearing off forever with and without a solemn oath, taking more physical exercise, reading inspirational books, going to health farms and sanitariums, accepting voluntary commitment to asylums. We could increase the list ad infinitum. Makes me think of Buzz Lightyear, that to infinity and beyond. Sorry. But we can only come to terms with alcoholism by exploring our own experiences. Alcoholics Anonymous shares that the combined experience and knowledge of the first 100. And we who follow do the same. That's what I'm trying to do now. But all of us have to come to our own conclusions. If we cannot accept the physical aspects of the illness, then the only way to be certain is to follow this final suggestion. By the way, it's the final suggestion. They don't really want you to try it because it's deadly dangerous. But if you're not convinced, this can be the only way to convince an alcoholic if they have this physical abnormality. End of page 31. We do not like to pronounce any individual as alcoholic, but you can quickly diagnose yourself. Step over to the nearest barroom and try some controlled drinking. Try to drink and stop abruptly. Try it more than once. It will not take long for you to decide if you are honest with yourself about it. It may be worth a bad case of jitters if you get a full knowledge of your condition. I've often heard it said that it's better to be in AA meetings pretending that you're an alcoholic than out there pretending that you're not. Well, I think that goes against the very core message of the great obsession, actually. It's not what Alcoholics Anonymous suggests. Quite the opposite, really. Because the truth is, if you've not accepted this, if you're faking that you're an alcoholic and trying to make it that way, you are playing with the great obsession. And my experience and my observation has shown me that if you play with this great obsession, in the end it always wins out. It might take many years, but in the end it will win out. You know what? Sometimes it just destroys you when you're sober. I have seen people destroyed by this over and over again, in so many, many horribly destructive ways. I remember meeting a young man many years ago. The first time I met him, he'd be about 2 years sober. He'd been about 21 probably at the time. He was doing okay, but he told me he was still plagued by this nagging notion that maybe he could control it and enjoy it. He'd stopped so young, you see. I saw him a couple of years later. This time he wasn't doing so well. He had remained physically sober, but his emotional, mental and spiritual health was quickly deteriorating. He'd had several sponsors, but still had this nagging notion. Some had even suggested that if he wasn't convinced, then maybe he needed to try controlled drinking, just to be absolutely certain, just to stop this plague. But he was terrified of drinking. He was caught in this horrible place. Over the years, I kept bumping into him from time to time. He lived quite a distance from me, but I would see him at things. And every time I saw him, it deteriorated. It got worse. As far as I know, he's not drunk. Although I've not seen him for quite a few years now, maybe 8 years now, I don't know. I do wonder what happened to him. Now, he's a very, very rare case because most folks just couldn't keep on like that. Eventually, they couldn't stay sober like that. They would drink. They would definitely drink. But I don't know what happened to him. I do hope one day I see him again. This illness is so powerful it can destroy and control you, even if you haven't touched a drop for a great deal of time. Recovery is about freedom and a life of meaning and purpose. To be of maximum use to God and the people around us, that's the real purpose. That's what I know. And recovery and freedom and a life of meaning and purpose is what is on offer here. But first of all, we have to fully concede to our innermost selves for recovery to even begin. Now, there's much more I could say about the physical aspect of the illness, how we are bodily different, how we have lost the power of control. But time only allows so much. I'm going on long enough, aren't I? You don't want me to go on forever. So I'm now going to move on to the mental aspect, although I've talked a little about that already. How we have lost the power of choice. I've talked about we've lost the power of control. Now I'm going to talk about how we've lost the power of choice. So if we accept that we have this physical abnormal reaction and that one drink will trigger what is described as the craving, then what must we do to not take that first drink? Simple, eh? So they say just stay away from one drink one day at a time. That's all you've got to do. It's all you've got to do. And when they used to say, "Oh, Danny, all you've got to do is stay away from one drink one day at a time," do you know what I heard louder than any other word? I heard the word all. And that's all I did. And do you know what? I kept getting drunk. So, for the real alcoholic, this is impossible. To say it's just utter nonsense, actually. It's a message of poverty, and it's deadly. And this is due to the mental aspect of this illness, that we have lost the power of choice, that we can't stay away from one drink one day at a time. Or we can't guarantee. For a period of time you can, but not for that long. And you don't know when it's coming. That insane twist. Page 23 from There Is a Solution. These observations would be academic and pointless if our friend never took the first drink, thereby setting the terrible cycle in motion. Therefore, the main problem of the alcoholic centres in his mind rather than in his body. If you ask him why he started on that last bender, the chances are he will offer you any one of 100 alibis. Sometimes these excuses have a certain plausibility, but none of them really make sense in the light of the havoc an alcoholic's drinking bout creates. They sound like the philosophy of the man who, having a headache, beats himself on the head with a hammer so he can't feel the ache. Crazy, isn't it? But I've so many experiences of this insanity striking. And it struck, sometimes when it struck, the sun was shining. Sometimes it was raining. I live in Manchester, it rains a lot. Sometimes it was Tuesday. Sometimes it was Saturday. Sometimes I was high as a kite. Sometimes I was suicidally depressed. Other times I wanted to destroy the world. Sometimes I was just normal. Sometimes my mind was racing. And other times, I was pretty calm, man. Pretty calm. Sometimes I was hanging out with old mates in a pub or a club. And on at least 2 occasions, it happened as I left the meeting. The insanity would just come. Like that. Sometimes the thought was all over me and I was fighting it for hours and days, it seems. And other times I've not had a thought for weeks, and then suddenly I was off again. I'll give you an example. During the early summer, I think, of 2003, I was attending a meeting on a Saturday afternoon, and it was at the Central Library in Manchester. It became my home group for many years, actually. I'd be a few weeks sober at the time. I wanted to be there. There was nothing much on my mind. I shared I was through for good and for all, the classic Dr. Bob line. I'd had enough, I was finished, and I meant it. I would have passed a polygraph, a lie detector test. I left the meeting with a whole load of other folk. We were heading toward Cafe Nero, something that we would do for many, many years. We crossed Albert Square together in good spirits, and then suddenly my head turned and I turned. I made my excuses and I left. I have a very vague memory of what happened, but I left town. I know that I left town. I got on a bus and I went to a bar way out of town that I frequented for years, which led me back to hell again. Going to hell again. Yeah. I have no real memory of going back or how I got to the bar, but I must have gone by bus. I was in what I would call a sober blackout. What the book calls a strange mental blank spot. The illness had me in its grip, and this was before I'd even touched one drink. This is the crux of the problem, the real mystery. This insanity when physically sober. Yes, the main problem centres in the mind, and this occurs when completely physically sober. Yes, the physical abnormality is kicked off by the first drink, but the damage is done before this happened. I was compelled to do the very last thing that I wanted to do. Yes, I was utterly powerless. I lacked the power to change my mind. Well, I wasn't even conscious of what I was doing this time. My life was completely unmanageable. I couldn't even manage the decision to do the one thing I so desperately wanted to do, the one thing I needed to do so desperately, the thing I needed to do above any other thing in my life, which was to stay away from that one drink, and I could not do that. And people kept telling me to just do that, and I couldn't do that. I've often heard it said that all we've got to do is watch our thoughts, our triggers, as if external circumstances cause an alcoholic to take the first drink. It's got nothing to do with the day. It's got nothing to do with the circumstances or the company I kept, but whether we still have an alcoholic mind. Step 2 tells us, doesn't it? Recovery from alcoholism is about being restored to sanity around the first drink. That's the whole point of this. From page 24, there is a solution. And this paragraph's in italics to emphasise. They emphasise the really important stuff for us by putting it in italics. We don't need to colour in our books, by the way. You can if you want. I'm just saying you don't have to. I don't. I like to read what's there without being blinded by all these highlights and stuff. I want to know it in my heart, what it's trying to teach me, really. So this bit's in italics because they really, really want to this is the key to everything. Here's the quote. The fact is, pay attention to the facts, they're really important. The fact is that most alcoholics, for reasons yet obscure, have lost the power of choice in drink. Our so-called willpower becomes practically non-existent. We are unable at certain times to bring into our consciousness with sufficient force the memory of the suffering and humiliation of even a week or a month ago. We are without defence against the first drink. Pay close attention when they state facts. Close attention. That seems pretty clear, doesn't it? There's no ambiguity here. At certain times, and we have no idea when those certain times will be. At certain times you cannot guard against it, and when it comes you have no choice. You don't think it through, you can't think it through. There's no tape to blooming well play through. And if there is, it gets mangled up. I come from the days when we had tapes. You young people won't know what the heck I'm talking about. But at certain times, not only does it get mangled up, there is no tape to play. And you don't know when that day will be. But it's not only that we are powerless, we are also beyond human aid. This is why the solution, according to Alcoholics Anonymous, is spiritual in nature. No doctor, no love of family, no group of friends can stop this insanity when it strikes. You can't talk someone through either. I once tried to talk someone through. A good friend of mine who's doing really well now. I'd be a couple of years sober. I was going into Manchester. I used to sing in a choir there, and we'd have choir practice on a Wednesday night. I'm not a choir boy in the classic sense. Don't get me wrong, it's not that kind. They're not those kind of people, really. But I went to Tesco's to get some food, and I saw a friend of mine staring at bottles of vodka. Oh, God. So I asked him what he was doing. I'm not going to give his name away. I nearly did then. And I took him for a coffee, and he was ranting and raving in the coffee shop down the phone to somebody that he'd lost his mind over. I cancelled going to rehearsals. I took him to a meeting. I made him share. I walked him to the bus stop. Thought, yes, I've saved this man's life. 3 o'clock in the morning, the phone goes. Shout, just screaming down the phone, absolutely off his rocker. Took him many years to get sober, but he's sober today. So I can't stop anybody drinking. Once it's got you, it's got you. You need to be restored to sanity. That is the key. From There Is a Solution, page 25. When this sort of thinking is fully established in an individual with alcoholic tendencies, he has probably placed himself beyond human aid, and unless locked up, may die or go permanently insane. These stark and ugly facts have been confirmed by legions of alcoholics throughout history. But for the grace of God, there would have been thousands more convincing demonstrations. So many want to stop, but cannot. Sometimes the insanity comes suddenly. Other times it's a battle. But the insanity always overcomes the alcoholic's personal power. It's important to understand that the insanity that's been described is not the crazy, insane things that a person does when drunk, although they are certainly insane. But non-alcoholic people can do insane things when drunk, horribly violent things when drunk. Just because a person does something when drunk doesn't make them alcoholic, by the way. Now, the insanity it's specifically discussing is that insane act that occurs when sober, that compels the sober alcoholic to take that first drink. Bill describes it wonderfully in his story, really. Here's a few examples. Page 5. I woke up. This had to be stopped. I saw I could not take so much as one drink. I was through forever. Shortly afterwards I came home drunk. There had been no fight. Where had been my high resolve? I simply didn't know. It hadn't even come to mind. Someone had pushed a drink my way and I had taken it. Was I crazy? I began to wonder, for such an appalling lack of perspective seemed near being just that. Page 6. One day I walked into a cafe to telephone. In no time I was beating on the bar, asking myself how it happened. Page 7. Best of all, I met a kind doctor who explained that though certainly selfish and foolish, I had been seriously ill both bodily and mentally. It relieved me somewhat to learn that in alcoholics the will is amazingly weakened when it comes to combating liquor. though it often remained strong in other respects. My incredible behaviour in the face of a desperate desire to stop was explained. Understanding myself now, I fared forth in high hope. For 3 or 4 months the goose hung high. I went to town regularly and even made a little money. Surely this was the answer, self-knowledge. But it was not, for the frightful day came when I drank once more. Page 8. Trembling, I stepped from the hospital a broken man. Fear sobered me for a bit. Then came the insidious insanity of that first drink, and on Armistice Day 1934, I was off again. Bill tried willpower, self-knowledge and fear to overcome the insanity, but the insidious insanity always won out, because he was powerless over the decision. That is the insanity of alcoholism. Bill had lost the power of choice. It uses the word insidious insanity somewhere, doesn't it? Just after this, really. And what does insidious mean? Insidious is an unseen, deadly danger. So you don't see it coming, and it's deadly. The last 2/3 of chapter 3, more about alcoholism, spends a great deal of time describing the insanity of alcoholism, what it calls the main problem of the alcoholic. Page 35. We shall describe some of the mental states that precedes a relapse into drinking, for obviously this is the crux of the problem. What does crux mean? Well, the crux is means the unsolved problem, this unsolved problem on which everything rests. This is the real puzzle of alcoholism. As they said in chapter 2, it's the main problem. It's just a different way of saying the main problem, the crux. It's just Bill's style of writing. He's saying the same thing in a different way. But on this, everything rests. This is the main feature, the baffling feature of alcoholism, the crux, the unsolved problem. And we don't know why. I remember one time I was with a friend whose birthday it was. I was in great spirits. I wasn't drinking. I was feeling good. I was feeling proud of myself. I turned drinks down, and then suddenly a pretty young thing offered me a drink, and this time I just took it. Just a little drink. And that led to all hell breaking loose. Going to hell again. Yeah. I was off again. I was off it for about a month, actually. It included a trip back to Yorkshire, and I brought her with me, and I caused holy hell. We were off our faces. I came back, and eventually, after about a month of hell, I slunk back to meetings. Why? Because there was nowhere else to go, was there? I couldn't live like that. I couldn't live with it, and I couldn't live without it. Again, the book suggests that if you don't believe that you are powerless over that decision, that you have lost that power of choice, the suggestion is to try and find out by trying not to drink. Page 34. As we look back, we feel we had gone on drinking many years beyond the point where we could quit on our own willpower. If anyone questions whether he has entered this dangerous area, let him try leaving liquor alone for 1 year. If he is a real alcoholic and very far advanced, there is scant chance of success. And that's what happened with my first relapse, my relapse back to the illness. I'd be about 4 months in this time. I got through Christmas, I got through New Year, I got through January and February for those that are feeling really good about it. I was feeling great, got money coming in, working really great. Work was going amazing. I was attending meetings every day. There was not a thought of a drink. My focus was purely on sobriety. I was not obsessing in the traditional sense of understanding, of obsessing. And then suddenly it happened. I was off again. Suddenly, the insanity returned, and I was compelled to do the very last thing that I wanted to do. I was utterly powerless over that decision. The truth is, it was not a conscious decision. The truth is, when I look back, the truth about my illness is that I'd lost the thing that made me a human being. I've lost free will. That's what it means, really. It was one of those strange mental blank spots. The insidious insanity. Insidious meaning an unseen deadly danger like a snake. The insanity strikes at you. You do not see it coming. I call it a sober blackout. It comes like that. It strikes like the snake. Insidious insanity. You do not see it coming. And it's also what happened with my last relapse back in early October 2003. It took a couple of weeks, but eventually it came. I attended my first convention in Manchester at the town hall. I often describe that day as perhaps the loneliest day of my whole life, for I have never felt more alone than I did that day. I was in no man's land. I knew I wanted sobriety, but I didn't want a spiritual solution. I wanted a third option. Most of us do, don't you? But there isn't a third option for someone like me. It's either a spiritual way of life or an alcoholic death. There ain't a third option, Danny. Which one? But I wanted to negotiate. There I was, surrounded by hundreds of people, all of them there for the very one reason I was there. As the day went on, I just got worse. I felt all right at the beginning of the day, but as the day went on, I just didn't want to be there. I didn't want to listen to you lot going on about your stuff and your solution. Reading those things on the wall drove me mad. And you know what? I didn't want to be long. At the end of the day, as I did the sobriety countdown, I discovered I was the second least sober person present. So I didn't even get the prize of being the least sober person. I'd be about 4 weeks sober probably. I left that day vowing never to return again. I had every intention of never coming back, and I didn't for a couple of weeks. I stayed in the house, terrified to go out. I had a birthday actually at this time, but I didn't go back to Yorkshire for fear of my emotions. I couldn't cope. But my sisters bought me a ticket to see Killing Joke play in Leeds, and that got me home. Spend the night with some mates, and that night was absolutely wonderful. I was out with a load of old mates who were so great with me and so proud that I was sober actually, and we had a wonderful night. The next day I had a conversation with my mum about some of the messed up stuff that happened when we were kids, but the conversation did not go the way that I wanted it. It did not go well at all. I left in a rage. I didn't drink back in Yorkshire this time. I got on the train and I came back, and as soon as my feet hit the ground in Piccadilly station, it struck again. I was off again, and this time it lasted for a few days, and then I came out of it, and I woke up with this voice inside me that told, I shared it earlier, that I could not do it. I could not stay away from one drink 1 day at a time. I was utterly powerless. I was beyond human aid. I fully conceded to my innermost self that I was utterly hopeless. I was beyond human aid. I believe I took the first step in recovery then, although I didn't realise it at the time. So how do we stop altogether? Well, the book states, for those who are unable to drink moderately, the question is how to stop altogether. We are assuming, of course, that the reader desires to stop. Whether such a person can quit upon a non-spiritual basis depends upon the extent to which he has already lost the power to choose whether he will drink or not. Many of us felt that we had plenty of character. There was a tremendous urge to cease forever, yet we found it impossible. This is the baffling feature of alcoholism as we know it, this utter inability to leave it alone, no matter how great the necessity or the wish. The real alcoholic cannot choose whether they can drink or not. The choice for us is to commit to the spiritual way of life or to carry on to the bitter end and die of alcoholism. So after a year relapsing in the rooms, I was ready to take certain steps. I was open to a spiritual solution. But my sharing this isn't enough, is it? So I'll give you some more examples, this time from the text. Here are some of the examples Alcoholics Anonymous offers. See if you identify with these, if you don't identify with me. There's Jim, begins with Jim, who began the journey into recovery but failed to enlarge on his spiritual life to grow in understanding and effectiveness. And how do we do that? By a life committed to helping others. He wasn't interested. It was all about him. It was all wrapped up in self. So resentment grew, and then one day, while going about his usual daily business, suddenly clicked, the insanity returned. Page 36. Suddenly, the thought crossed my mind that if I were to put an ounce of whiskey in my milk, it couldn't hurt me on a full stomach. I ordered a whiskey and poured it into the milk. I vaguely sensed I was not being any too smart, but felt reassured as I was taking the whiskey on a full stomach. Next, they describe the bizarre jaywalk who cannot resist the impulse of running in front of moving vehicles. Seems absurd, but it's just the same as an alcoholic taking the first drink, or hitting himself on the head with a hammer, or headbutting the walls at 3 in the morning because you can't sleep, which is what I used to do. Not really very sane behaviour, is it? Page 38. He tries every known means to get the jaywalking idea out of his head. He shuts himself up in an asylum, hoping to mend his ways. But the day he comes out, he races in front of a fire engine which breaks his back. Such a man would be crazy, wouldn't he? Wouldn't he? And finally, they give us Fred, my favourite actually. A smart, successful man who accepts he has some of the symptoms, but cannot fully concede to his alcoholism. He accepts, though, that he cannot drink again. He has the physical part, but he does not accept that he's powerless over the decision. He accepts he's lost the power of control, but not the power of choice. It's vital to recognise that. Page 39 to 40. He made up his mind to quit drinking altogether. It never occurred to him that perhaps he could not do so in spite of his character and standing. Fred would not believe himself an alcoholic, much less accept a spiritual remedy for his problem. We told him what we knew about alcoholism. He was interested and conceded he had some of the symptoms, but he was a long way from admitting he could do nothing about it himself. He was positive that his humiliating experience, plus the knowledge he had acquired, would keep him sober the rest of his life. Self-knowledge would fix it. And Fred's an example of that relapse is not down to feeling bad, feeling good, or feeling indifferent. It's just that the insanity can return at any time and you won't see it coming. It's insidious. An unseen deadly danger, remember that. The point that they are making is that it's got nothing to do with circumstances, just that the fact of still suffering from the alcoholic mind, of being an unrecovered alcoholic. It's simple, really, not being restored to sanity. His story continues, page 41. I had been out of town before during this particular dry spell, so there was nothing new about that. Physically, I felt fine. Neither did I have any pressing problems or worries. My business came off well. I was pleased and knew my partners would be too. It was the end of a perfect day, not a cloud on the horizon. Not a cloud on the horizon. Life couldn't be better. He continues. I went to my hotel and leisurely dressed for dinner. You can just see him whistling as he puts on his dicky bow, can't you? As I crossed the threshold of the dining room, the thought came to mind that it would be nice to have a couple of cocktails with dinner. That was all, nothing more. I ordered a cocktail and my meal. Just like that. No response to the thought. Just did it. Had a thought and did it. That was it. No tape. Alcoholism is a hopeless condition. An alcoholic is beyond human aid. And we have to fully concede this fact, fully concede to our innermost selves. We have to see that we are in a state of despair for hope to appear. And thankfully there's hope, and we see it in those around us who are fully armed with the facts about themselves, those people who have recovered. that have the knowledge of the problem and the knowledge of the solution and how to recover, the experience of recovering from the seemingly hopeless condition of mind and body that is alcoholism. They have the experience and knowledge, and they combine it together. Combined experience and knowledge. That's what I'm sharing today, and that's what the book Alcoholics Anonymous shares on those first 100, the pioneers. As we're reminded in the final paragraph in chapter 3, page 43. Once more, the final reminder. Once more, the alcoholic at certain times has no effective mental defense against the first drink. Except in a few rare cases, neither he nor any other human being can provide such a defense. His defense must come from a higher power. Sounds good, but it also sounds bad, because if you're anything like me, that's another problem. But I'll talk about that next week, next time. So that's it really on the problem. Over the next 3 video shares, I will discuss the solution, the power, how to access the power, and how to live by the power. Next time I'm going to talk about the solution, the power, essentially steps 2 and 3. So thank you for listening. I hope it's been helpful. I've had a ball actually doing this, really enjoyed it. I hope you have too. I hope you could identify. All I say to you as I say goodbye is, keep on rocking in the free world, all you groovers and you shakers out there. Stay free.